In a sleepy little town, where the streets curved gently through rows of weathered houses and blooming dogwoods, life moved with a kind of rhythm that was both comforting and unremarkable. The townsfolk were content to let the days unfold as they always had, with only the occasional flutter of excitement, a church bazaar, a parade, the arrival of spring. Yet even among these easygoing souls, there was one man who stood apart, not for how quickly he moved, but for how deliberately he chose not to. Gerald was a familiar figure on Main Street, a tall man with a gentle stoop, silver hair combed with care, and shoes always polished, though never hurried. He wore a coat, even when the sun was bright, and he tipped his hat to every passerby, as if time were an old friend he intended to savor. Every morning at precisely 7:10, Gerald would leave his small house on Willow Lane. He would lock the door quietly, slip a silver pocket watch into his vest, and begin his daily walk through the park. The park was Gerald's cathedral. The world there was hushed, dew glistening on the grass, and the air still flavored with night's coolness. He greeted the ducks, nodded to the dog walkers, and paused to listen to the distant chiming of church bells. Gerald never rushed, never hurried his steps, even when clouds threatened rain, or when the wind bit a little sharper than usual. He moved through life as if every second deserved its own ceremony. At the corner cafe, he was as much a fixture as the iron chairs and the faded green awning. The staff knew his routine. He would always choose the same table, the one overlooking the little garden where sparrows flitted and old roses clung to the fence. He would order a plain black coffee, no sugar, no cream, and set his silver pocket watch on the table in front of him. There he would sit, hands folded, gaze fixed on the watch as if waiting for it to reveal a secret. Curiosity was inevitable. Passers-by, regulars and newcomers alike, would pause to wonder aloud, "Why do you still carry that old watch, Gerald? Don't you use a phone?" Children would sometimes ask to touch the shiny case, while their parents smiled indulgently. Gerald never bristled at the questions. Instead, he would smile softly, the corners of his eyes crinkling with memory, and answer, "Because it doesn't ring, it doesn't buzz, it doesn't remind me to hurry." His words would linger, simple but profound, like a stone dropped into a still pond. Then, for those who lingered, he would tell the story. The watch, he explained, was a wedding gift from his late wife. She had chosen it for him, engraved their initials on the back, and given it with a laugh, saying, "Now you'll always know when it's time to come home." For decades, the watch had ticked along with their lives, through laughter and arguments, through the birth of children and the departure of friends, through quiet dinners and noisy holidays. But on the day she died, the watch stopped at 11:43. The exact moment her heart ceased its steady, loving beat. Gerald never tried to fix it. He carried it every day, a silent memorial to the time that had mattered most. To Gerald, the most important moment of his life had already stopped. Everything after was for living slowly and remembering deeply. The town grew used to Gerald and his watch. Some whispered he was stuck in the past, unable to move on. Others admired his devotion, envying his ability to resist the world's constant urging to do more, be more, hurry more. To Gerald, it was simply a matter of priorities. He had seen what was lost when life was rushed, and he chose deliberately to live differently. One brisk afternoon, As golden leaves danced in the breeze, a young man claimed the table next to Gerald's. He was new to town, or perhaps just passing through. He wore the city on his sleeve, headphones around his neck, a laptop open, two phones buzzing in tandem. His thumbs moved in a blur, swiping, typing, scrolling, as if afraid that stillness might swallow him whole. Between sips of overpriced espresso, he glanced over at Gerald, at the old man sitting with nothing but a cup of coffee and a silent watch. He chuckled, not unkindly, and asked, "Don't you feel left behind? Who even lives like that anymore?" For a moment, Gerald's eyes twinkled with amusement. He picked up the pocket watch and, with the same care he reserved for all important things, placed it in the young man's hand. The young man turned it over, surprised by its weight and coolness. It was heavier than he expected and utterly quiet. Gerald's voice was gentle, but carried a conviction that made the young man pause. "Some people don't live slowly because they have nothing to do," Gerald said. "They live slowly because they finally understand what's worth doing and what isn't." The words seemed to hang in the air, challenging the young man's assumptions, asking him to reconsider what he thought he knew about time. That night, the young man lay awake, the memory of the heavy, silent watch pressing against his thoughts. He thought about all the things he rushed through: meals eaten in haste, conversations cut short by notifications, moments blurred into a stream of tasks and obligations. He wondered what it would feel like to let a moment linger, to allow silence instead of always filling it. The next morning, Gerald followed his routine as always. He walked through the park, greeted the ducks and the dog walkers, and settled at his usual table. He set the pocket watch down, ordered his coffee and waited. And then, to his quiet delight, the young man returned. He had no phone in his hand, no laptop, no headphones, just himself and a willingness to see what might happen if he sat still for a while. The two sat in companionable silence, watching the world move around them. For a moment, it felt as if the whole town had slowed down. Traffic quieter, conversations softer, even the birdsong more measured. The world, it seemed, had decided to breathe a little slower. Over the weeks that followed, the young man became a regular at the cafe. He never rushed. Sometimes he brought a book, sometimes he simply watched the clouds drift by. He learned to savor the taste of coffee, to notice the way sunlight fell across the table, to greet the sparrows who shinned to beg for crumbs. He and Gerald spoke often, but never in a hurry. Their conversations meandered like the little river that wound through town, touching on memories, dreams, regrets, and joys. From time to time, others joined them. A mother with a sleeping baby, grateful for a pause in her day, an old friend who had once measured success by the number of meetings crammed into an afternoon, now seeking something quieter. Even the cafe owner, who had spent years rushing from table to table, began to linger a little longer when delivering their coffee. The table became a kind of sanctuary, a place where time was allowed to rest, where no one needed to be anywhere but here. Gerald never claimed to have all the answers. He offered no sermons, no sweeping declarations about the meaning of life, but his presence was a gentle reminder that time, once lost, cannot be reclaimed, and that the things which truly matter, the people we love, the moments we remember, the simple pleasures, often reveal themselves when we are willing to move a little slower. The story of Gerald and his watch began to ripple through the town. People started to notice how often they checked their phones, how quickly they moved from one thing to the next. Some tried, if only for a day, to walk more slowly, to look up at the sky, or to listen instead of always speaking. Small changes, barely perceptible at first, began to accumulate. The local librarian started hosting story hours with no scheduled end, letting the tales run as long as the listeners wished. The bakery began to offer a slow breakfast, inviting customers to sit and enjoy their pastries rather than rushing out the door. Even the office workers found themselves lingering by the window, watching the world go by, instead of counting down the minutes to their next meeting. Gerald watched all this with quiet satisfaction. He understood that change did not come quickly, nor should it. It was enough to plant a seed, to offer an alternative, to show by example that life could be lived differently. He continued his daily walks, his coffee at the cafe, his silent communion with the pocket watch that marked the moment his world had changed forever. There were, of course, those who scoffed. Some saw slowness as laziness, a refusal to engage with the demands of modern life. They dismissed Gerald as an eccentric, a relic of a time best left behind. But even they, from time to time, found themselves pausing as they hurried past the cafe, wondering what it might feel like to sit for a while and let the world slow down. Seasons changed. The park bloomed and faded. Leaves turned gold, then bare. Snow dusted the rooftops. Gerald grew older, his steps a little slower, his hair a little whiter. Yet each day he continued to honor the ritual that had become his own quiet act of devotion. A walk through the park, a cup of coffee, the watch on the table, and the willingness to simply be. One spring morning, the young man, who had once rushed through every moment, arrived at the cafe with something new. A small velvet box, carefully wrapped. He placed it on the table in front of Gerald, who looked at him with gentle curiosity. "Open it," the young man said, his voice a little uncertain. Inside was a brand-new pocket watch, gleaming and perfect, its hands ticking with steady confidence. "For you," the young man said, "so you'll always have the time. From now on." Gerald smiled, touched by the gesture. He picked up the new watch, feeling its unfamiliar weight, its promise of precision and order. Then, with great care, he placed it beside the old one. Side by side, they sat, one marking a life already lived, the other a life still unfolding. He looked at the young man, who now understood what it meant to let a moment linger, to let life unfold at its own pace. "Thank you," Gerald said quietly, "but I think I'll keep both. One to remind me of what I've lost, and one to remind me of what I've found." The young man nodded, understanding that wisdom does not always come from speed or progress, but from knowing when to hold on and when to let go. From that day forward, the two watches became a symbol, not just for Gerald, but for everyone who gathered at the cafe, seeking a place where time was not the enemy, but a companion. Years passed. The town changed, as all towns do. Shops opened and closed, children grew up and moved away, new faces appeared at the cafe. But the story of Gerald and his watch endured. It became part of the town's folklore, a lesson whispered from parent to child, from friend to friend. People would say, "Remember Gerald? He taught us that the only time that matters is the time you choose to notice." And sometimes, when the world felt too fast, they would walk through the park, sit at the old iron table, and let themselves breathe a little slower. And so, in a world that seemed always in a hurry, there remained a small corner where time was allowed to rest, where memories lingered, and where the most important moments were not measured by the ticking of a clock, but by the depth of our attention and the willingness to live, if only for a while, as if we were in no hurry at all.